Terrifying. Relentless. Imagine a player so feared that even the toughest enforcers hesitated to drop the gloves. A man who didn't just fight, he owned the chaos, thrived in it, and turned the ice into his personal battleground. Bob Probert wasn't just the toughest enforcer in NHL history. He was the juggernaut, the Wayne Gretzky of hockey enforcers, a boxer on skates. If you saw him skating toward you, you had two choices: fight or pray. Because when Probert came for you, it wasn't just a fight, it was an assured destruction. But behind the blood, the brawls, and the bone-crushing blows was a story even wilder than his reputation. And to truly understand the legend of Bob Probert, we have to start at the very beginning. Born on June 5th, 1965 in Windsor, Ontario, Probert grew up under the tough, unyielding hand of his father. He was raised to be strong, to never back down. And it showed. When his father passed away, Probert didn't shed a tear at the funeral. Instead, he buried his emotions deep, letting them out in other ways through his fists, and eventually through the bottle. By 14, he was drinking. By 17, his battle with alcoholism had already begun, taking hold during his first season in junior hockey. But while his struggles off the ice were mounting, on the ice, he was making a name for himself. At 16, he was a goal scorer, racking up 60 goals and 100 points in minor hockey. That all changed in the Ontario Hockey League. Playing for the Brantford Alexanders, Probert didn't set out to be an enforcer. It happened by accident. A rookie in the OHL, he got into a scrap with Kingston's top tough guy. One punch, knockout. And just like that, he had a reputation. From that moment on, fighting became part of his game. He learned quickly, and before long, his penalty minutes skyrocketed. By the time the 1983 NHL entry draft rolled around, Probert was one of the toughest young players in junior hockey. The Detroit Red Wings took notice, selecting him in the 3rd round, 46th overall, the same draft where they picked future legends Steve Yzerman and Joe Kosher. Probert had size, he had skill, but most of all, he had toughness. The kind of raw, unfiltered aggression that GMs craved in the NHL's golden age of enforcers. At 6 feet 3 inches and over 200 pounds, he was a bruiser with the reach, power, and endurance to go toe-to-toe with anyone. He was primarily a right-hander but could switch to his left mid-fight, a rare and dangerous skill. Early on, his fighting style was wild, unrefined, pure chaos on skates. But even then, there was something different about him, something bigger. Probert wasn't just another enforcer. He had the potential to be more. Before reaching the NHL, he continued his development, bouncing between the Brantford Alexanders, the Hamilton Steelhawks, and finally, the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds. With each stop, his reputation grew, and soon, the NHL would find out exactly what that meant. By the 1985-86 season, Bob Probert started the year with the Adirondack Red Wings, Detroit's minor league affiliate. But it wasn't long before he got the call-up to the big leagues, and he was stepping into an NHL that was in transition. The classic enforcers of the 70s, Dave Schultz, Bobby Nystrom, Stan Jonathan, John Wensink, Terry O'Reilly were gone. The old guards like Clark Gillies, Kurt Fraser, Bane Wilson, Larry Playfair, Nick Fotiu, and Dave Semenko were fading, and a new wave of fighters was taking over. By the mid-80s, names like Tim Hunter, Marty McSorley, Dave Richter, and Jim Kite were making their mark. And right alongside them, a tall, fearless kid from Windsor, Ontario, was about to change the role of enforcer forever. For hockey fans, it sometimes takes a few fights to see what a guy's made of. However, with Probert, it didn't take long before the NHL got its first real glimpse of what he could do on November 11th, 1985. The Red Wings were in Vancouver, facing off against the Canucks. Probert, fresh off a call-up from Adirondack, found himself squared up against another young gun trying to make a name for himself, Craig Cox. The American-born Cox was all offense, no defense, the type of fighter who swung for the fences with every punch. The moment the gloves hit the ice, it was an all-out war. They came together fast, trading furious blows. Cox was relentless, hammering Probert with clean, heavy rights. For a moment, it looked like the kid from Detroit was in trouble, but Probert wasn't just another brawler. He steadied himself, adjusted his stance, and started throwing back, blow for blow, shot for shot. And then, he took over. He unleashed a flurry of punishing long-range rights that sent Cox stumbling, drained from the exchange. When it was over, Cox's legs gave out not from a knockout punch, but from sheer exhaustion. This was more than just a rookie scrap. This was the moment Bob Probert arrived, and in Detroit, a city that worships toughness, Probert was about to become a legend. That fight against Cox was more than just a brawl. It was a statement. It earned Fight of the Year honors, and for good reason. It was raw, brutal, and a true test of heart. Probert had a lot to learn, but one thing was clear. He had the fire, the hunger, the kind of unshakable will that separates good enforcers from legends. And from that moment on, he was off and running with the big club. In Detroit, he found his perfect counterpart, Joey Koser. Together, they formed one of the most feared enforcer duos in NHL history, the Bruise Brothers. Probert wasted no time proving he belonged. Over the next few weeks, he squared off against the towering Dave Richter, then went toe-to-toe with the fast-throwing Rick Toksha of the Flyers in a heated two-fight game. And when he faced Toronto's Gary Nyland, it turned ugly with headbutts, hair-pulling, and even a helmet used as a weapon. But nothing compared to what happened on January 13th, 1986. That night, the Red Wings and Maple Leafs erupted into a full-blown, bench-clearing brawl. An old-school, no-holds-barred melee that had fists flying everywhere. And in the middle of it, Probert locked up with one of the league's toughest men, Bob Big Daddy McGill. The fight was long, punishing, and relentless. But just when it seemed to be over, Probert did something that shocked everyone. He headbutted McGill, knocking him out. It was one of the most vicious headbutts the league had ever seen. A moment so brutal that the NHL had no choice but to suspend him for 4 games. But Probert wasn't about to slow down. He took on Boston's Gord Kluzak, then mixed it up with enforcers like Brian Curran, Chris Nealon, and Lee Norwood. Eventually, the Red Wings sent him back to Adirondack to help with their playoff run. But even in the minors, he made his presence felt, going toe-to-toe with some of the AHL's toughest brawlers and leading Adirondack to a Calder Cup championship. It was an impressive rookie season, but what stood out wasn't just the fights, or the wins, or even the championship. It was the way Probert announced himself to the NHL. He wasn't just another enforcer. He was a wild card, unpredictable, explosive, willing to go further than anyone else. While Bob Probert may have made a name for himself as a rookie, his second season came with some hard lessons, and the first one came fast. Early in the season, Probert squared off against veteran enforcer Kurt Fraser, now with the Chicago Blackhawks. Fraser was battle-tested, a true heavyweight who had been through wars, and he wasted no time humbling the young Red Wings tough guy, delivering a quick, decisive beatdown that sent a clear message. Welcome to the big leagues, kid. But Probert wasn't the type to dwell on a loss. Instead, he went on a tear. He took down Scott Stevens, back when Stevens was still in Washington, still young, and still more than capable with his fists. Then, on November 26th, he stepped into the ring with an old enemy, Bob McGill. This wasn't just any fight, it was the rematch. The year before, Probert had made headlines for headbutting McGill during a bench-clearing brawl. Now, under the bright lights of Joe Louis Arena, it was time to settle the score. But that wasn't the only war Probert fought that night. Later in the game, he squared off against Wendell Clark, the Maple Leafs power forward, and one of the most fearless fighters in the league. The two went toe-to-toe in a slugfest that would go down as one of the best fights of the season. Clark landed heavy shots early, but Probert battled back, showing the kind of resilience that would define his career. He may not have done enough to break even, but the fight was an instant classic, a Fight of the Year candidate for the 86-87 season. Then, out of nowhere, Kevin Maguire, a young Toronto scrapper, took advantage of the moment and sucker punched Probert. Probert didn't take the bait, but you can bet he took note. Probert would go on to best Calgary's technical wizard, Tim Hunter, and was beginning to pick up momentum before finally getting his chance at Gary Nyland again. It had been a year since their ugly, chaotic brawl that turned into hair-pulling and headbutts. This time, Nyland was wearing Blackhawks colors, and on January 11th, 1987, at Chicago Stadium, they met again. This wasn't just a fight, it was a war inside a war. A full-on line brawl had broken out, and with the refs tied up elsewhere, Probert and Nyland were left to settle their unfinished business. Early on, Nyland controlled the fight, landing solid shots as the chaos swirled around them. But as the seconds passed, fatigue set in, and when Nyland made a fatal mistake dropping his head and Probert struck. A brutal uppercut. It landed flush, sending Nyland crumbling to the ice in a heap. It was a knockout that sent a message across the league. Probert was no longer just another tough enforcer. He was a rising force, and just a few days later, he settled another score. This time, it was Kevin McGuire, the same man who had sucker punched him earlier in the season. And Probert didn't just win. He hammered McGuire in a brutal punch-out. By now, the league had taken full notice. Probert was a made man in the enforcer world, but success came at a cost. Now, every young, hungry fighter wanted a shot at him. The challenges were endless, and one of the first to step up was a name Probert would never forget: Todd Ewen. And this fight would be one for the ages. Now, just like every other team in the Norris Division during the mid-'80s, the St. Louis Blues knew they had to toughen up. The Red Wings had Probert and Kokor. The Blackhawks boasted Bane Wilson and Kurt Fraser. The North Stars had an aging Willie Plett and a young Bob Rouse. And the Maple Leafs had fiery talents like Wendell Clark and Kevin McGuire, plus seasoned enforcer Bob McGill. The Blues weren't exactly rolling with a murderer's row of enforcers. So, during the 1986-87 season, they decided to make a move. They called up Todd, the Animal, Ewen, from their IHL affiliate in Peoria. Ewen was a big, tough kid who had earned his stripes with the new Westminster Bruins in juniors. Strong as an ox and with fists that could hit like a mule, Ewen quickly made a name for himself. His first NHL fight came in December against Blackhawks defenseman Mark Bergevin. Ewen threw a flurry of rights that left Bergevin overwhelmed and earned the rookie respect. But while that bout helped build Ewen's confidence, it wasn't enough to truly test him at the NHL level. That test would come in late January during a home-and-home series against the Detroit Red Wings, who were charging forward with their young enforcer, Bob Probert. In the first game of the series, Ewen left his mark. He roughed up Detroit defenseman Dave Lewis in the third period, and it didn't take long for Probert and Joe Kocher to take notice. The next night in St. Louis, the Red Wings came in hungry, but the Blues were leading 2-0 early in the first period. That's when the tension hits a boiling point. Behind the play, Ewen and Probert met. They dropped the gloves by the nearby boards, locking onto each other right away. Probert came out swinging, unleashing a flurry of right hands. But Ewen wasn't intimidated. With one brutal right hook, he landed flush on Probert's jaw, dropping him instantly. Probert hit the ice hard, and Ewen tried to land a couple more punches before the linesman stepped in. As Ewen skated to the penalty box, flush with victory, Probert lay dazed on the ice, teammates rushing to his side. In the past, a devastating loss like that, especially a one-punch knockout, could ruin a fighter. It was the kind of loss that knocked you down and made you question your place. But Bob Probert wasn't like most fighters. For him, that knockout was just the beginning. He knew that getting Ewen back couldn't wait, and Probert wasted no time in planning his revenge. In the second period, after the Red Wings had battled back to tie the game, Probert and Ewen were at it once more. This time, right at center ice. Probert came out strong, looking like he might finish the fight decisively, but as he wound up throwing a left hand, he lost his footing and slipped. The linesmen were quick to jump in and end the altercation before either fighter could gain a clear advantage. Even though the fight ended prematurely, it felt like Probert had done enough to earn a slight edge. News of the fights quickly spread throughout the league, and Ewen's reputation grew by leaps and bounds. Their rivalry was quickly becoming one of the most anticipated in the league, and the hockey world began circling March 7th on their calendars. When the date finally arrived, it was on. The game was once again in St. Louis. and the crowd was buzzing with anticipation as soon as Ewan and Probert hit the ice. The game wasn't even 3 minutes old when the two dropped the gloves for the third chapter of their saga. This time, they squared off awkwardly at first, but quickly came to grips. The fight was a back-and-forth exchange, each fighter landing some solid shots. They grappled close before stepping apart, trading long-range rights. By the end of the bout, Ewan had switched to holding on, fatigued but still wide-eyed, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Probert, on the other hand, was relentless, continuing his pursuit of victory. When the linesmen finally broke them apart, Probert skated directly to the penalty box, his steps full of business and with a spring in his step, like he was ready to go another few rounds. Ewan, though worn out, could still feel the adrenaline coursing through him, but it was clear Probert had earned the decision. However, Ewan had earned something too: respect. For Probert, the Ewan fights were a defining moment in his early career. It was his first major test as both a fighter and an enforcer. His response to that brutal defeat spoke volumes about his character. He didn't hesitate to answer the bell again, picking himself up off the ice and going after Ewan, time and time again. Even though the rematch wasn't nearly as one-sided as Ewan's victory in the first bout, Probert showed his true mettle. It was clear even in only his second season that Probert had the traits of a great fighter, and the league was about to feel the full force of that greatness. Probert's 1987-88 season was a year of trials and triumphs as he faced off against some of the toughest men in the league. He didn't shy away from any challenge, continuing to battle tough guys across the NHL, further solidifying his place as one of the league's most feared enforcers. He had a brutal encounter with Vancouver's Michel Petit and made quick work of the Islanders' Brian Curran. But it was against Philadelphia's newly minted heavyweight, Craig Berube, where Probert found himself in the fight of his life. Berube, with his machine gun right hand, gave Probert all sorts of problems. In their first encounter, Berube outpunched Probert, breaking his nose in the process. It was a tough sight seeing Probert on his knees, holding a towel to his face with blood pouring out. But Probert was not one to back down. A few days later, they squared off again in a wild April Fool's Day showdown, Probert still sporting raccoon eyes from the earlier battle. Though the fight ended in a draw, the third bout saw Berube once again getting the better of Probert with that lightning-fast right hand. In the playoffs, Probert had to face old foe Kurt Fraser, who had given him a licking earlier in the season. The fight with Fraser was long, filled with wrestling and grit, but Fraser managed to survive. In the next round, Probert tangled with Toronto's Ali Frade and Chris Kotsopoulos, before wrapping up the year with a victory over Edmonton's tough Kevin McClelland. But it was the 1987-88 season that saw Probert truly hit his stride, showcasing why he was becoming an enforcer legend. It started with a big game against the Maple Leafs at Maple Leaf Gardens on October 17, 1987. Probert met Wendell Clark in a rematch that saw him dominate the Leafs' power forward, setting the stage for an intense showdown with Dave Semenko, the Leafs' newly signed enforcer. Semenko was known for underhanded tactics, sucker punches, headbutts, kneeing, hair pulling, and he wasted no time in mugging Probert, jumping him from behind and laying into him. This was one of the rare moments where Probert was visibly enraged, struggling to break free from the linesman. It was the late 80s, and with the Norris division being as fierce as it was, everyone knew there would be more. On November 19, 1987, Probert was back at it, facing off against Vancouver's Craig Cox in another memorable two-fight affair. Their first bout had already set the bar high, but this rematch did its best to outdo the first, with both men going all out. Probert scored the win with two head-snapping uppercuts that tilted the fight in his favor. This battle quickly became a contender for Fight of the Year. But the night wasn't over. Later in the game, Probert fought Cox's partner in crime, Darryl Stanley. Stanley tried to get in some offense, but Probert's reach was too much. A crushing right hand sent Stanley's helmet flying into the organist's booth, knocking him out cold. Probert continued his dominance, getting into wild scraps with Boston's Jay Miller, New York's Mark Tenorti, and Buffalo's Kevin Maguire. In a particularly heated moment with Maguire, after Probert had dumped Sabres goaltender Tom Barrasso, Maguire returned the favor by knocking Red Wings goalie Greg Steffen to the ice. McGuire then went after Detroit's star center Steve Yzerman, and Probert wasn't having it. As the scrum ensued, Probert circled like a shark, looking for an opening. When Barrasso got too close, Probert knocked his face mask off with a punch. Then, when he saw McGuire down and covered by an official, Probert fired a missile at him, bouncing the punch off the ice to land it. With that, Probert was not only proving that he was one of the toughest fighters in the league, but also one of the smartest, knowing when to pick his battles, when to throw the big punch, and when to take advantage of a downed opponent. He was becoming an enforcer for the ages. January 28, 1988, would be the night that Probert finally got his long-awaited chance at Dave Semenko, and he didn't disappoint. At Joe Louis Arena in Detroit, the much-anticipated rematch between these two titans was everything it was built up to be. Semenko, known for his gritty and tough style, made an attempt to wrestle with the younger Probert, but Proby's power was undeniable. He landed 3 massive bombs, each one an exclamation point declaring him the new heavyweight force to be reckoned with. Probert had arrived. From there, his march to dominance continued with victories over Calgary's Jim Poplinski and former Memorial Cup foe Ken Baumgartner before facing off against Chicago's tough defenseman Glenn Cochran. Cochran, a well-known enforcer from his days with the Flyers, was no easy task. But Probert, showing his growth as a fighter, overwhelmed Cochran right from the opening bell. It was a faute-you-like barrage of punches, and though Cochran fought back, he couldn't withstand Probert's onslaught. Proby finished him off, further cementing his place among the league's toughest. Probert's year wasn't done yet. He continued to build on his legacy with memorable bouts against Marty McSorley and Brian Curran, showing no signs of slowing down. The wins over Semenko, Cochran, and Wendell Clark were the culmination of a season that truly belonged to Probert. Those victories symbolized the passing of the torch, Semenko, who would retire at the end of the year, and Cochran, whose effectiveness was waning, were no longer the top dogs. Probert had taken the crown. 1987 to 88 was a season for the ages, where Probert put everything together, his toughness, skill, and leadership on the ice. He didn't just establish himself as a feared enforcer, he proved he was a legitimate top-tier player. With 398 penalty minutes, he solidified his place in the heavyweight discussion, but he also showcased his talent by scoring 29 goals and setting a Red Wings record for most points in the playoffs, breaking a mark previously held by the great Gordie Howe. In a season that could only be described as perfect for a player with the reputation of a top heavyweight, Probert not only secured his place among the league's best, but also solidified his legacy as one of the most feared fighters and complete players in the NHL. By 1989, Probert had firmly established himself as the undisputed top dog in the league, but his rise to dominance came at a significant personal cost. Off the ice, his struggles with addiction were becoming impossible to ignore. It all came to a head when, on a trip crossing the Detroit-Windsor border, Probert was arrested for drug possession and trafficking after 14 grams of cocaine were found hidden in his underpants. This marked a turning point, but the roots of his issues stretched back to his early years in the league. Probert's descent into addiction began in 1986 during the post-game celebrations after the Adirondack Red Wings won the Calder Cup. That night, Probert tried cocaine for the first time, and before long, it became a regular part of his life. He was buying an ounce of coke every week for $800, and by one estimate, he spent $42,000 a year on the habit. While his on-ice performances were still respected, the toll of his substance abuse was becoming increasingly apparent. Probert was in and out of rehab 5 times by the time he was 22, with his addiction lingering over him throughout his career. In 1989, his legal troubles hit a peak. Probert was sentenced to 3 months in jail and 3 months in a rehabilitation facility, and he was banned from playing in Canada for the duration. These issues kept him sidelined for much of the 1988 to 89 and 1989 to 90 seasons, a major setback in his career. But when he returned in 1990 to 91, he was determined to reassert himself as the top heavyweight in the NHL. Probert's first test of the season came against New Jersey's Alan Stewart, a warm-up fight that set the stage for the main fight of the year. New Jersey had a young up-and-coming enforcer named Troy Crowder, and the two dropped the gloves in a highly anticipated matchup. However, The fight was a wake-up call for Probert, as Crowder managed to bloody him, delivering a surprising loss to the Red Wings heavyweight star. The fight sent shockwaves throughout the league, and the rematch between Probert and Crowder became one of the most anticipated events of the season. Before their second showdown, Probert kept busy by dispatching tough opponents like Shane Churla, Jay Miller, Bob McGill, and Stu Grimson. But it was his January 9th, 1991, clash with Dave Brown that caught the most attention. Brown, widely regarded as one of the top fighters in the league, and Probert had long been seen as the two most feared enforcers in the NHL. Their 1987-88 fight had ended inconclusively, but this time, Probert came out on top, decisively thrashing Brown and solidifying his claim as the league's best fighter. Finally, on January 28, 1991, Probert and Crowder faced off for the highly anticipated rematch. The first fight was a fast-paced exchange, with Probert landing several powerful right-handed punches that eventually sent Crowder to the ice. Probert got his revenge, but Crowder wasn't done yet. After the first fight, Crowder immediately sought a second go at Probert, launching a flurry of punches before Probert even had a chance to respond. This time, the fight went longer, but Probert once again prevailed, with Crowder eventually losing his footing and falling to the ice. Probert had now won the trilogy of fights, and his dominance was on full display. He finished the 1991 season with a string of one-sided victories, including wins over Darren Kimball, Neil Wilkinson, and Kevin McGuire, solidifying his place in the history books as one of the greatest fighters in NHL history. The 1991 season was one of the greatest single seasons ever for a fighter, and Probert proved that despite his off-ice struggles, his presence in the ring was unmatched. Probert's ability to overcome adversity and assert his dominance on the ice despite his personal demons is a testament to his legacy as one of the fiercest enforcers the game has ever seen. By 1991-92, Bob Probert wasn't just a tough guy, he was the tough guy. The undisputed king of the ice, the heavyweight champ of hockey's most brutal battles. Every young enforcer with something to prove lined up for a shot at him. One of the first challengers that season was Link Gayetz, a monster at 6 feet 3 inches, 235 pounds, throwing bombs from both sides. On November 14th, 1991, he stepped up to Probert, and the two unleashed hell, fists flying, neither man backing down. When it was over, no clear winner, a deadlock. But the challenges kept coming, and in New York City, a new threat was emerging. Ty Domi. Small, scrappy, loud. Barely 5'10", but with an oversized mouth and an attitude to match. He wasn't just fighting, he was putting on a show. Taunting, smirking, stirring up trouble. When he squared up with Probert on February 9th, 1992, few expected him to last. Domi proved everyone wrong. He cut Probert open, went blow for blow, and as the blood dripped from Probert's face, Domi skated to the penalty box grinning. He raised his fists, mimicking a championship belt, calling himself the new king of the NHL's enforcers. Probert was furious. Losing a fight was one thing, but this, the mockery, the showboating, that burned. The rematch wouldn't come until the next season, but the hype was already out of control. The media built it up like a heavyweight title bout, and when the two finally met again, Probert had one thing on his mind: revenge. This time, he didn't hesitate. No feeling out, no testing reach. The moment they grabbed hold, Probert exploded. A flurry of rights, relentless, punishing, overwhelming. Domi tried to counter, but it was too much. Then, the knockout shot, a sneaky right to the temple. Domi hit the ice. Payback's a bitch. The fight lasted over a minute, but its impact stretched far beyond that. It was everywhere. Highlight reels, sports shows, news broadcasts, a moment frozen in time. And when the final stats came in, the result was clear. Bob Probert was still the king. Bob Probert entered the 1993-94 season still sitting on the throne as hockey's undisputed enforcer. He tore through the competition, dismantling challengers like Jeff Odgers, Greg Bird Dog Smith, and a young Donald Brazier. But the fight that defined the year, the one etched in hockey history, came on February 4th, 1994. The war in 1994, Two legends, two warriors, Probert versus Marty McSorley. Both were battle-tested veterans with hundreds of fights behind them. This wasn't just another scrap, it was a slugfest for the ages. They threw everything they had, trading bombs in the middle of the ice, neither willing to give an inch. Midway through, McSorley hit the ice, but with pure grit, he pulled himself back up. By hockey standards, this was a marathon, over a minute of relentless, punishing blows before the officials finally stepped in. When it was over, both men skated to the box, exhausted. Probert slow and steady. McSorley was bloodied, his jersey ripped away but unbroken. It was a masterpiece, one of the greatest fights the sport had ever seen. But Probert's season wasn't over. Another young enforcer was waiting in the wings. Sandy McCarthy, 6'3", 225 pounds, long reach, and a mean streak. As a rookie, he had bulldozed his way through the heavyweight division, carving out a reputation as one of the toughest newcomers in the league. When the Calgary Flames rolled into Joe Louis Arena in April 1994, McCarthy wanted the ultimate prize, Probert himself. The fight began in chaotic fashion. Probert charged straight at McCarthy, unloading heavy shots, but something was off. McCarthy hadn't even dropped his gloves. The officials, well aware of his tactics, let it play out. Probert paused, not realizing he'd been baited, and that's when McCarthy struck. The rookie unleashed a flurry, catching Probert off balance. By the time it was over, the king had fallen and a new force had arrived. That summer, everything unraveled. In July 1994, Probert crashed his motorcycle in West Bloomfield Township. Lying on the pavement, he looked up at the officers and muttered, "Just charge me with the usual." The test told the rest of the story. His blood alcohol level was nearly 3 times the legal limit, and there was cocaine in his system. The Red Wings had seen enough as Senior Vice President Jim Devellano made it official. "In my 12 years with the organization, we've never spent more time on one player and his problems than we have on Probert." Detroit cut ties, refusing to offer him a contract. A few days later, the Chicago Blackhawks took a chance and signed him. But before Probert could ever step onto the ice, the league stepped in. Charged with OUI and disorderly conduct, he was hit with an NHL ban for the entire 1994-95 season. The 1995-96 season began with the hope that Bob Probert could reclaim his place at the top. But from the start, something was different. The aura of invincibility had faded. Early in the season, the unthinkable happened. Probert got dropped. Pittsburgh's Chris Tamer, a fighter nowhere near Probert's level, caught him clean and sent him to the ice with a quick left hand. If there were doubts before, this confirmed it. Probert had lost something. What was even more shocking, there was no urgency to avenge the loss. A younger Probert would have made it his mission to even the score. But this version? He let it slide. But things went from bad to worse when Probert ran into Tony TNT Twist. Twist was a wrecking machine in 1995-96, a power puncher making a serious run at the title of the league's toughest man. And to truly claim the throne, he had to go through Probert. When they finally met, Twist made his statement loud and clear, overpowering the former champ. For anyone still clinging to excuses, Probert's final fight of the season erased all doubt. In the playoffs, he squared off against Colorado's Chris Simon, a rising force in the heavyweight ranks. Simon dominated, unloading a barrage of unanswered lefts that left Probert helpless. The message was clear: the new generation had arrived. The winds of change were undeniable. The Proberts and the Browns were no longer the top dogs. A new heavyweight hierarchy had formed, and Probert was on the outside looking in. Things didn't get any easier in 1996-97. Probert suffered 2 more brutal losses to Twist, cementing his status as the new dominant enforcer. By the end of 1997-98, there was no doubt left that Probert was a different fighter. The fire that once drove him to settle every score was gone. He still had memorable battles against the likes of Reed Simpson, Brian Marchment, Darren Langdon, Stu Grimson, and Ty Domi, but he was no longer among the sport's true elite. Then came the 1998-99 season. It was, without question, The worst season of his career as a fighter. He took a beating from Boston's Ken Belanger and lost twice to Donald Brassier, the same Brassier who once feared a prime Probert. He dropped a decision to T. Domi and got rocked by Dave Moose Morissette, an eager minor league enforcer chasing the dream of taking down a legend. The only bright spot was a vintage moment against young powerhouse Scott Parker. Probert unleashed one last TKO victory, proving he could still dish out punishment when it mattered. But there was no escaping the truth. The king was no longer the king. After hitting rock bottom in 1998-99, Bob Probert roared back in 1999-2000, giving fans one last season to remember. It wasn't just a comeback, it was a reminder of who he was. He kicked off the year with a slugfest against minor league enforcer Mad Mel Angelstad. Probert took a stiff right hand that momentarily stunned him, but in true Proby fashion, he regrouped, took control, and finished strong to claim the victory. From there, he went on a warpath, racking up wins over some of the toughest names in the league: Stu Grimson, Eric Cairns, Georges Larasse, Grant Marshall, Wade Ballack, and Donald Brassier. These weren't just fights, they were battles against the best. Grimson, Laraki, and Brassier were elite heavyweights. Cairns was no slouch, and Angelstad had a reputation as one of the top fighters in the minors. Ballack, though still rising, would go on to become one of the most respected enforcers in the game. Just a season earlier, Probert looked finished. Now, he was back proving he still had gas left in the tank. Then came September 20th, 2000. Probert stepped in against Buffalo Sabres enforcer Eric Bolton, and the two went to war. It was vintage Probert Wild exchange, brute force, and sheer will. But while it was another battle for the books, it would also be his last truly great fight. He played 2 more seasons, still accepting challenges from young enforcers eager to test themselves against the legend. He even had his famed 3-fight game against Jody Shelley. But the Probert who ruled the heavyweight division was gone. The King's reign was officially over. By the start of the 2002-03 season, Probert still believed he had something left, but the Blackhawks and head coach Brian Sutter saw things differently. His skills had faded, but his name alone still carried weight. Every young enforcer in the league wanted a shot at him not because of the game, but because of who he was. Probert admitted he had to start turning guys down because it became more about chasing a trophy than settling a score. His last full season came in 2001-02, and after that, he moved into the radio booth for the Blackhawks, closing the book on one of the most legendary enforcer careers the NHL had ever seen. At his peak, Bob Probert was a force of nature. When his primal instincts kicked in, there was no stopping him. He wouldn't let up until he ended the fight on his terms. He had the power, the endurance, the sheer will. The longer a fight went on, the more it played into his hands, as if every second wore his opponent down while fueling him for the final blow. But it wasn't just about the fights, it was about the crown. Once he became the NHL's undisputed heavyweight champion, he had to defend it night after night against an endless line of challengers. Bob Probert wasn't just a fighter, he was the measuring stick, a rite of passage. If an enforcer could just survive a bout with Probert, if they could make it out without being dropped, it was considered a win. And the ones who stepped into the ring with him, they never forgot. There were 2 sides to Bob, you just didn't want to be on the wrong one. Tony Twist. It was like riding a bull, you better hold on because he seemed to get more worked up as the fight went on. Troy Crowder. I think it had a lot to do with his personal disregard for his physical well-being. He wasn't the least bit concerned about getting hit. Stu Grimson. As another tough guy going up against him, you may win, you may lose, but you knew it was going to be one hell of a fight. Marty McSorley. But Probert was more than just an enforcer. He could play. From 1985 to 1994, he wasn't just the league's most feared fighter. He was an underrated power forward who played a crucial role in the Detroit Red Wings' resurgence. He helped lead them to back-to-back Final Four appearances against the powerhouse Edmonton Oilers in the late 80s. In 1988, during his NHL All-Star season, Probert put up a career-high 29 goals and shattered Gordie Howe's playoff scoring record with 21 points in 16 games. He still holds the Red Wings' all-time record for penalty minutes with 2,090, a staggering average of 232 per season. And while his fists made him hockey's most feared man, his hands weren't just for fighting. Over a 16-year career split between Detroit and Chicago, he racked up 163 goals and 221 assists. The respect he commanded was unparalleled. In Tough Guy, his autobiography, Steve Yzerman recalled the 1988 NHL All-Star Game. All the greats, like Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier, were there, and the first thing they wanted to do was meet Probie. I remember them coming over and asking me, "Can you introduce me to the big fella?" He was revered by players, and it wasn't just because he was a tough guy. It was because he was a great player. But perhaps the best description of Probert came from fellow enforcer Chris Kotsopoulos. He was like a battleship cruising the ice, ready to take on all comers. Plenty of guys were just simply scared, less of him. But for all the glory that came with being the NHL's most feared enforcer, Bob Probert also bore the weight of it. The role took its toll, both physically and mentally. His battles weren't just on the ice. Off it, he fought addiction and legal troubles that followed him throughout his career. Car and motorcycle accidents, DUIs, a cocaine possession arrest at the Windsor-Detroit border. Probert's struggles led to 10 stints in rehab, 2 NHL suspensions, and even jail time. Even in retirement, life wasn't always smooth. There were still a few run-ins with the law, lingering echoes of a past that refused to fully let go. But as time went on, Probert found stability. His focus shifted to his family, his wife, 4 children, and even 2 Yorkies named Carly, and dedicated himself to charity work, appearing to have finally gained control of his life. But the damage had already been done. On July 5th, 2010, while boating on Lake St. Clair with his children and extended family, Probert suffered a fatal heart attack. He was just 45. The man who had spent his life absorbing punishment, who had stood toe-to-toe with the toughest men in hockey, was gone. And then came the devastating truth. Posthumous examinations of his brain at Boston University revealed that Probert had suffered from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, the degenerative brain disease caused by repeated blows to the head. He played in an era with no concussion protocol. When he took a punch, he shook it off. Hell, sometimes it woke him up and gave him a second wind. He fed off the chaos and thrived in it. But over time, the endless fights and the relentless impacts, they added up. Memory loss, mood swings, depression, confusion, and many more CTE symptoms slowly crept into his daily life. In his eulogy, longtime teammate Steve Yzerman, who had been drafted alongside Probert in 1983, called him a man with fists of stone, but a kind heart and gentle soul. Bob Probert's story is both legendary and tragic. It lays bare the brutal reality of the enforcer's role, the link between hockey's culture of toughness, substance abuse, and the long-term effects of head trauma. He was once the toughest man in the NHL, but even he couldn't fight the toll the game had taken on him. Bob Probert's legacy as the NHL's ultimate enforcer is truly one of a kind. His career, one of grit and determination, stands as a testament to a time in the game when fighting was just as essential as scoring. Probert didn't just fight, he fought the best, time and time again. He sought out the toughest opponents, eagerly rising to the challenge, and his record against the league's hardest hitters is unmatched. Rivals like Wendell Clark, Dave Brown, Stu Grimson, Tony Twist, Craig Berube, and Donald Brashear were just a few of the legends he faced, and he fought each one like it was his last. Over his 16 seasons in the NHL, Probert was more than just an enforcer. He was a champion in the truest sense. His extended rivalries with the game's toughest players, his brutal work ethic, and his ability to stay on top in a career full of physical punishment made him a legend. With 285 fights in his career, averaging 1 every 4 games, and finishing with 3,300 penalty minutes, Probert's contributions as a fighter are unparalleled. As fighting fades from the modern game, Probert's position as the greatest fighter of all time seems more solidified than ever. His career was more than just blood and bruises. It was about legacy, respect, and a fierce will to be the absolute best. Bob Probert wasn't just a fighter, he was the last of a dying breed, the kind of player we'll never see again. In the end, Probert's legend is cemented not just by his accolades, but by his unwavering spirit. He may have left the ice long ago, but he'll always remain the all-time king of the NHL's enforcers. Please like the video to support the channel.